Welcome, Wanderer. I know what you are. Someone looking to get a better grasp on all the various systems in Diablo 4. Well, look no further. You found yourself upon Diablo Academy. I'm your host, MacroBioBoi. If you're brand new to the channel, go ahead and check the playlist that this is in, where I'll be listing off every single subject that we're going to be covering throughout this Academy course. If you're new to the game, a returning veteran, or somebody who's always wanted to get their teeth into theory crafting, I figured I could make a series of videos, little bite-sized digestible pieces that will walk you through the different systems that are in the game, so that when you are looking at two different pieces of gear, trying to figure out a different Paragon setup, or maybe trying to make a decision between a unique item or an aspect, you will have everything at your fingertips to be able to understand everything that you need to make the strongest build possible. If you appreciate the video, remember to subscribe below. You don't want to miss out on any of these uploads as they come out, so you can keep up to date with the most recent information and the best practices. Leave a like on the video and comment down below what you're hoping to see next. But that's enough yapping for right now. Let's go ahead and get into it. In this video, we'll be talking about critical strike chance and critical strike damage. Arguably one of the most important damage scalers in the game for the majority of builds. First, I'll go over the very basics, so if you feel like you already have a lot of this down, feel free to skip ahead to the next timestamp, or just jump around to the timestamps as you find valuable. But when we're talking about critical strikes, you just have to know that there are color codes for the various damage types that are happening in the game. We'll be using bone splinters as our example here. You'll see as I attack, you'll see white numbers, yellow numbers, eventually we'll get a blue number, and maybe even an orange number. That white number right there is basic damage. This is not being modified by critical strikes or by overpowering. Yellow damage numbers are going to be critical strikes. You'll see that they're going to be significantly higher than our base white damage number. The orange and the blue numbers that you just saw right there, blue shows an overpower. This is a different video that we'll be covering in the future. And orange is when you have successfully overpowered as well as successfully critically struck. Every character in the game will naturally have 5% chance to critically strike, and this can occur on any damage type that is not a damage over time effect. Sadly, damage over time can neither crit nor overpower. But then there will be additional stats in the game which will further increase your chance to critically strike, and you can cap out at 100% chance. Going over 100% chance doesn't benefit you in any way, but if you are at 100%, all of your damage numbers will always be at least yellow and possibly orange if you successfully overpower as well. And the base effect that you get from critically striking is increasing all of your damage by 50%. And this is where a lot of people tend to run into the first issue that they think happens when they're using a critical strike. But when we're looking at these damage numbers and we see the yellow damage numbers, what you need to understand is that means that all of your damage has critically struck. So anything that's going to modify your crit damage will modify this damage outcome. And that's really important to remember. If you see yellow, your damage was critical strike damage. That'll make some things later down the road make a lot more sense. The first issue that you're going to run into in understanding this system is that the character sheet here is actually lying to you. And sadly, it's lying to you in two different ways, but the second way will also be covered in a future video. First, let's just talk about how it's currently misconstruing the information. If you look down in the actual box right here off to the right of my head, you'll see that at the bottom it says that I have 208 critical strike damage, both from my items as well as my Paragon. But sadly, the critical strike damage bonus up there says that I have 360. And that's because the actual additive damage that you have is modified by the bonus that you get from critting. That's a 50% damage bonus. So let me go ahead and explain it in layman's terms. If you had no critical strike damage on your build at all, and you were to successfully critically strike, it would increase your damage output by 50%. If you have additive critical strike damage on you, that'll get added into a bucket, and all of the additive damages in the game go into this bucket, and they just ask the question, did you successfully meet their requirements? So if you had plus 100 shadow damage, it would just ask, is the damage that you're doing shadow? If yes, put that additive damage in the bucket. Similarly, this asks, if you critically struck, then put your critical strike damage in the bucket. Now let's go ahead and prove that in a real world way so you can better understand what I'm talking about. I had recently developed a fully functional and accurate damage calculator for the Necromancer class. So let's go ahead and use this tool to be able to get a better understanding of what we're supposed to be looking at here and the expected outcomes both with and without critically striking. I'm going to set up the damage calculator as if it was my own character. We're going to be using bone splinters here. And with the magic of the calculation being done already, we would expect to see a range of damages from 41 damage up to 76, with an average damage of 58. As we attack here, ignoring the critical strike damage for just now, we need to be looking at the base damage just to make sure that our calculator is giving us the appropriate range of the damage that we're expecting. While I think my tool is airtight, you should be able to see the results as well. But as I've been yapping here, if you followed along with all of the white damage numbers, you'll see that none of them are falling outside of our range, obviously with a little bit of wiggle room here for rounding. And it looks like it's pretty spot on. I'm not seeing anything above that 76 range. I'm not really seeing anything below 41 or 42. This seems pretty airtight. Now let's go ahead and calculate what our bonus should be whenever we critically strike and see if those yellow numbers tend to fall within the same range. For our example, I'm just going to change our critical strike chance to 100% because the calculator is actually smart enough to show you average damage at your critical strike chance, but we're only going to be looking at crit damage numbers. So our critical strike damage range should be between 192 and 352, averaging about 272. So looking at just the yellow numbers here, and I can zoom in so that they're a little bit more differentiated, you'll notice that all of our damage ranges, again, seem to be within the calculator's range that we expected. Nothing below the 192 and nothing above the 352, although we are getting close to both ends of our range there. So bare minimum, the calculator is correct, which means that the logic that I'm explaining to you is also correct. And where this really becomes a problem is when you add on other critical strike damage specific multipliers. So just try to remember these two numbers in your head. We're currently at 208 and the outcome is 362. But we could sacrifice our Iron Golem. Our Iron Golem gives us a bonus that says that you deal 54% multiplicative increased critical strike damage. And when we add on this multiplier, you should expect to see your character sheet change, and it does. So while I still only have 208 additive damage, my readout now says 611. Now, let's go ahead and show that in the calculator, and I'll just go ahead and pull out the relevant part so you don't have to look at all of it. So we can grok this a bit better, because it turns out this is just not how it works at all, but people continue to get hung up on it. With the interesting thing about this misunderstanding is that it actually vastly underrepresents your true damage. So even if you were to use this as an idea of how to build out your character, you would still be successful because your build is actually significantly stronger than you think that it is. But let me just go ahead and show you the equation. I know this is a little bit of a bore fest, but you really need to understand this working, how the equation works, for it to really set in for why this is an issue. In the true version of this calculation, there are a couple things that we need to take into account, and we'll look at the minimum damage here. We take our minimum damage value, we multiply this by our skill damage, multiply that by our bonus from intelligence, and then since we critically struck, we will increase this by 50%. Now right here is where it will calculate the additive damage. And since we need to add a non-crit damage to it, I have a pretty good example of something that's very niche. This ring, as one of its tempers, says that it adds on 87.7 damage to a cursed enemy. So if I were to apply a curse to this target, I would get the benefits of this additive damage. And like I explained previously, all of your additive damage goes into the same bucket. They're not differently manipulated by stats on your gear. They just say, if you did it, then get the benefit here. So we're going to add our total critical strike damage, which is found here, and our total additional additive, which is found right here. Do a quick little calculation to get that value. Then you just have to understand that there's a variable for skill damage, a variable for damage reduction of the target. And then, since we're going to critically strike, we're going to increase all of our damage by that Iron Golem damage bonus. And that's how we get to the true damage range, 380 to 697. With the different understanding of how all of this works, we're going to do everything the exact same, except that here, rather than just add together our two additive damages and adding an additional multiplier to the end of the equation here, we're actually just going to modify only our critical strike damage by this crit damage multiplier, and then add that separately to our additional damage here. And you'll notice that, again, you come out with a significantly lower outcome. Now let's go ahead and see whether or not we can ever get a crit to range above 581 damage in this example. So again, I just have to apply a curse to the target to be able to test this out, and let's see what damage numbers we're getting. Already seeing some pretty high ones, a 624 there as one of the crits, a 689 there as one of the crits. And obviously we'll ignore the overpowers here, but you'll see that we are consistently getting above 600 damage, all the way up to 680 on the top end of our yellow damage numbers here, which would be, according to our true calculation, the actual range of damage, whereas according to the false equation, where you apply crit damage multipliers just to your crit additive damage, you get a significantly lower expectation, and our damage numbers exceeded it. So upon proving that our calculation is accurate, proving that the true damage range means that crit multipliers don't only modify crit damage, but instead apply to the totality of your damage, let's go ahead and wrap this all up in a nice bow so that you can start making some really good decisions about your own build. Critical strike chance and critical strike damage is an incredibly powerful tool in Diablo 4, where basically any build that is not a damage over time build should seek to get as close to 100% chance to crit as possible. Not only do you just gain an inherent 50% multiplier of all of your damage, but any aspects or effects in the game which say increase your critical strike damage by a multiplier will further increase all of your damage whenever that number goes yellow or orange, like when you overpower as well. Critical strike damage multipliers do not only apply to your additive damage in your character sheet, and as such, whenever you're comparing builds, you need to look at the bottom true additive damage number in the character sheet readout as opposed to the top number, which is misconstruing and misapplying various multipliers in the game to a damage source in a way that is not true to how the damage works in game. Even a small difference in critical strike chance can represent a huge increase in damage. Going from 50% chance to crit all the way up to 75% chance to crit is much more than just a 25% increase in your damage, as well as being able to rely on having consistently high average damage outcomes. If you can always rely on doing a set amount of damage to kill a monster in a certain number of hits, you never need to second guess whether or not a low roll here or there will negatively impact you or possibly lead to an extreme circumstance like your character dying in hardcore or something like that. So if your build can reach 100% chance to crit, it often will want to. Critical strike damage multipliers will act along with any other multipliers that you have as well. So if you are a build which overpowers or applies vulnerable very often, all of these things add on to one another, each multiplier applying separately, further increasing your total damage output. I would argue that increasing your chance to crit is almost always worth more than increasing how much critical strike damage you have, making it so that you get the minimum 50% bonus, as well as whatever additive damage you have and other multipliers you have, is definitely going to further increase your damage than merely increasing the additive damage pool without reaching that 100% cap. And just remember, going over 100% chance does not increase any of your benefits at all. And then lastly, when comparing critical strike damage to any other damage source, you just have to ask the question, how often do I apply it? And simply for critical strike damage, you just take your chance to crit multiplied by the total additive damage that you have. You can do this similarly with critical strike damage multipliers, since they will only apply if you crit. So if you had a 50% crit damage multiplier, but you were only going to crit 50% of the time, that would only be worth 25% damage increase on average. There you go. I hope that this first introduction to the Diablo Academy, hosted by MacroBioBoi, will help you to better understand the critical strike damage system and how you can better implement it into your own build and use these various methods of comparing their damages to be able to make better informed decisions about what is going to increase your damage the most. Hopefully, the totality of this video series will make it so that you basically don't need to watch my stuff anymore. You can just go out and do your own theory crafting. But make sure to check back in case you missed something, or when I have another video uploaded, you don't want to miss out on any of it. Thank you very much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.